For over a century, the world's most famous cave paintings drew millions of visitors and thousands of researchers to the caves of Ice Age Europe. The charging bison of Altamira, the stampeding horses of Lascaux, the entire field organized itself around these spectacular animal images, studying them, dating them, arguing endlessly about what they meant. And almost nobody noticed the other marks. Small geometric shapes, sitting quietly on the same walls, right next to the animals, sometimes underneath them, sometimes painted directly over them. Dots, lines, spirals, crosses, too simple to look important, too abstract to interpret, too easy to dismiss as decoration. One researcher finally stopped dismissing them and started counting instead. What she found, across 368 cave sites and 30,000 years of human history, was a pattern so consistent it can only mean one thing. Someone was trying to say something, and nobody alive today knows what it was. For over a century, researchers studying Ice Age cave art focused almost exclusively on the figurative images. The animals, the handprints, the occasional human figures posed in hunting scenes or ritual dances. These were spectacular. They were emotionally immediate. They photographed beautifully for textbooks and museum exhibitions, and they were, frankly, easy to build an entire academic career around interpreting, because a painted horse looks like a horse, and that gives you somewhere to start. Nobody is disputing the significance of those images. The animal paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, and dozens of other European cave sites genuinely deserve every bit of attention they have received over the past century. They are among the most remarkable creative achievements in the entire history of the human species. But here's the detail the field walked past for over 100 years. Alongside every one of those famous animal paintings, sitting on the same walls, often in the same panels, sometimes painted in the same pigment by what may well have been the same hand on the same day, are geometric marks. Dots, lines, circles, triangles, spirals. Crosshatching. Simple, abstract shapes, tucked into corners, scratched into surfaces, painted beside or directly over the animals everyone came to study. Most researchers who noticed these marks at all dismissed them without a second thought. Decoration, doodling, idle scratching by someone with nothing better to do while waiting for the pigment to dry on the real artwork nearby. The marks were too simple to seem important, too abstract to offer any obvious interpretation, too small and too quiet to compete with the spectacular animals sharing the same walls. That dismissal held for over a century, and it was wrong. Here's the number that should have caught someone's attention decades earlier than it actually did. These geometric signs, the ones everyone ignored, actually outnumber the figurative art by at least 2-to-1 across the entire European cave record. For every famous painted bison, for every charging horse, for every dramatic hunting scene that ended up in a textbook or on a museum postcard, there are at least 2 geometric marks sitting on the same walls that nobody ever thought to systematically catalog. Think about what that ratio actually means. The marks everyone dismissed as unimportant were literally the most common form of visual expression left behind by Ice Age humans anywhere in Europe. More common than the animals, more common than the handprints, more common than every other category of cave art combined. And for over a century, the overwhelming majority of that material sat there, unrecorded, uncatalogued, unstudied by anyone approaching it as a serious, potentially meaningful body of evidence in its own right. It took until the 2010s for a single researcher to do something nobody in the entire history of the field had ever actually done before. Walk into those caves with a database rather than a sketchbook, systematically record every geometric sign on every accessible wall, combine that fieldwork with published records from hundreds of additional sites, and ask one very simple, very direct question that nobody had ever formally asked before. Do these marks form a pattern? The researcher who finally asked that question was a Canadian paleoanthropologist named Genevieve von Petzinger, working out of the University of Victoria. And the scale of what she set out to do is worth understanding directly, because it explains why nobody had ever attempted it before her. She personally visited 52 European rock art sites, Not the famous, well-trafficked showcase caves that appear in every documentary and every introductory archaeology textbook. The full range, major sites and minor ones. Well-known caves and obscure shelters that had only ever been documented in a handful of specialist reports most working archaeologists had never read. Sites in France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, scattered across an enormous geographic area, connected by nothing except the fact that Ice Age humans had once entered them and left marks on their walls. At every single site, she documented every geometric mark she could find on every accessible surface. Not the animals, not the handprints, the geometry, the dots, the lines, the spirals, the crosshatches, the strange angular shapes tucked into corners and scratched onto surfaces that nobody had ever formally recorded as a distinct, independent category of evidence. Then she did something that turned a large personal fieldwork project into something genuinely unprecedented. She combined her own data with published archaeological records from hundreds of additional European cave sites, reports stretching back decades, compiled by researchers who had dutifully noted the presence of geometric signs in their own documentation, but had never treated them as the primary subject of any sustained, systematic study. The result was the world's first comprehensive database of Ice Age geometric symbols, 368 separate European cave sites, a time span stretching from roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years before present. 30,000 years of human symbolic activity cataloged in one place, searchable, sortable, ready to be analyzed for exactly the kind of large-scale pattern no individual site study could ever reveal on its own. Nobody had ever built anything like this before. And it is worth being honest about exactly why that gap existed for so long, because the reason is not flattering to the field. It was not because the task was technically impossible. The archaeological reports already existed. The caves had been studied, sketched, photographed, and published for decades. The geometric signs were sitting right there in the published literature, noted in passing, occasionally illustrated in appendices, but never treated as the primary object of any sustained, systematic research program. The data was available. It had simply never been collected because nobody thought the signs themselves were important enough to warrant this kind of attention. Von Petzinger found previously undocumented geometric signs in 70% of the caves she personally surveyed. 7 out of every 10 sites she visited contained marks that no prior researcher had ever formally recorded at all. Marks sitting right there on the walls, visible to anyone who looked, that the entire field had walked past for generations without ever writing them down. And when she finally analyzed the full assembled database, comparing sign types across sites, across regions, and across tens of thousands of years of documented cave use, the result genuinely shocked her. Not because the pattern was complicated, because it was shockingly simple. Across 368 sites, spanning 30,000 years and an entire continent, Ice Age humans used just 32 distinct geometric sign types. 32. Not hundreds. Not a gradually expanding library of shapes growing steadily more complex and more varied over the millennia, the way you would reasonably expect any developing symbolic system to evolve over that much time. The same dots, lines, spirals, tectiforms, claviforms, crosshatches, penniform shapes, and hand stencils, repeated over and over, cave after cave, millennium after millennium, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the edges of Eastern Europe. Let that number actually settle for a moment, because its full implication is easy to miss if you move past it too quickly. 30,000 years is an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. Entire civilizations rose and collapsed during that window without leaving a trace. The gap between the oldest known use of these signs and the youngest is roughly 15 times longer than the entire span of recorded human history. And across that entire enormous stretch, the system barely changed at all. Think about what that level of consistency actually requires. Random marks do not produce this kind of pattern. If these were meaningless doodling, idle scratching by bored individuals sitting in dark caves with nothing better to do, you would expect enormous variety. Every individual who picked up a piece of charcoal or dipped a finger in pigment would produce their own unique, unrepeated marks, shaped by nothing more than personal impulse and the geometry of the surface in front of them. Over 30,000 years and 368 separate sites, that kind of random activity would generate hundreds or thousands of distinct forms, not 32. 32 specific shapes, maintained with recognizable consistency across that much time and that much geographic distance, is not what random decoration looks like. It is not what idle doodling produces. It is what a system looks like. A shared, transmitted, deliberately maintained set of symbols, passed from one generation to the next, carried from one cave site to another, understood by the people using them in a way that kept the repertoire stable across a span of time. No modern symbolic system has ever come close to matching. For context, the Latin alphabet most of the Western world uses today is roughly 2,700 years old. 32 geometric signs, maintained consistently for 30,000 years, represents a symbolic system roughly 11 times older than the alphabet you are reading these words in right now. Von Petzinger herself has been careful and precise about what she claims this consistency actually proves. She does not call these signs writing, because writing, in the strict definition most linguists use, requires signs that encode specific spoken language, and nobody has demonstrated that connection for these geometric marks. What she does say, directly and with confidence, is that the consistency of the system strongly suggests these signs were meant to transmit information, not randomly, not decoratively, deliberately, with shared understanding across an enormous stretch of human time. And sitting inside that database, waiting to be noticed, was a second pattern that caught von Petzinger off guard even more completely than the number 32 itself. Because the timeline she expected to find inside the data turned out to be running in exactly the wrong direction. Von Petzinger expected to find a slow, gradual increase in complexity over time. A handful of simple signs appearing at the very earliest sites, dots and lines in basic shapes, growing steadily more varied and more sophisticated as Ice Age culture itself matured and developed across the following millennia. That expectation was not a guess. It was the standard model of how symbolic systems are supposed to evolve, supported by examples from every other known case of human symbolic development throughout recorded history. Simple, first. Complex, later. Innovation building on innovation, generation by generation. The data said the opposite. Roughly 65% of the 32 signs were already in active use during the very earliest period of European cave art, the Aurignacian, stretching from approximately 40,000 to 28,000 years ago. 2/3 of the entire system, present from the very beginning, appearing fully formed in the old Stolas-decorated caves on the continent, with no simpler precursor stage visible anywhere in the European record. Think about what that single finding actually means, because it is easy to skim past without fully absorbing the implications sitting inside it. If 2/3 of the sign system was already in place when the first European cave paintings were being made, then the system itself is almost certainly older than the European caves. It did not develop gradually on the walls of Lascaux and Altamira over the course of 30,000 years of slow, in-place experimentation. It arrived in Europe already substantially complete, carried there by the migrating human populations who entered the continent from somewhere else. And the only somewhere else those populations could have come from, based on everything genetics, archaeology, and physical anthropology currently understand about the deep history of human migration, is Africa. Modern humans evolved in Africa and spent tens of thousands of years there before any population ever migrated into Europe. If the geometric sign system was already 65% complete by the time it first appears on European cave walls, the development that produced those signs must have been happening somewhere during those preceding African millennia, long before anyone carrying those symbols ever reached a European cave to paint them on. That is not a small implication. It pushes the origin of systematic human symbolic communication backward in time by an unknown but potentially enormous margin, out of the European cave record entirely, into a period of African human development that left considerably less physical evidence behind for modern researchers to study directly. Von Petzinger has stated this connection plainly. The global distribution of certain geometric signs, she argues, increasingly suggests a common point of origin in Africa. She has been careful to frame this as a hypothesis rather than a confirmed conclusion, noting that considerably more evidence, particularly from African rock art sites, would be needed to test it properly. But the European data alone, on its own terms, already makes the case remarkably difficult to avoid. A sign system that arrives nearly fully formed in the earliest European caves is a sign system whose formative period happened somewhere else, earlier, and the only candidate that fits both the genetics and the geography is the same African homeland modern humans left roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago. And one additional detail in the global archaeological record supports that idea with genuinely unsettling directness. Some of the same geometric signs documented across European Ice Age caves also appear in caves on the opposite side of the planet. In Indonesia, in Australia, dated to the same 30,000 to 40,000 year window. Dots, hand stencils, lines, shapes recognizably similar to their European counterparts, painted onto cave walls separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, on land masses with no known direct contact with Europe during this period at all. Sit with that detail directly, because it is genuinely one of the most unsettling findings in the entire field of human prehistory. The oldest dated cave art currently known anywhere in the world is not in France. It is not in Spain. It is on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, where hand stencils and figurative paintings have been dated to at least 40,000 years ago, roughly the same age as the earliest European examples. And in Australia, rock art traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years include geometric motifs that overlap recognizably with signs documented in von Petzinger's European database. These sites are not neighbors. Europe and Southeast Asia sit on opposite ends of the largest landmass on Earth. Australia is separated from both by thousands of miles of open water that, even at the lowest Ice Age sea levels, required genuine ocean crossings to reach. There is no plausible mechanism by which a symbolic system could have been transmitted directly between these populations during the period in question. No trade route, no migration corridor, no shared cultural contact of any documented kind, which leaves only two possible explanations for the overlap, and both of them are extraordinary. The first possibility is independent invention. Separate human populations living on opposite sides of the planet with no contact between them whatsoever independently created the same set of geometric symbols from scratch, arriving at recognizably similar forms through pure coincidence or through some shared cognitive architecture built into the human brain itself. The second possibility is common origin. The symbolic system predates the geographic separation entirely. It was already present, already in use, already being transmitted from generation to generation inside the founding African population before any of the great migrations that eventually populated Europe, Asia, and Australia ever began. When those populations separated and spread across the globe, they carried the system with them, the way they carried their stone tool traditions, their fire-making skills, and their language. Von Petzinger herself has addressed this question directly. She believes the global distribution of these signs increasingly points toward a common point of origin in Africa, though she has been explicit that this remains a hypothesis awaiting further evidence rather than a confirmed conclusion. Here is what makes that hypothesis so difficult to dismiss, even in its current preliminary state. The alternative, independent invention on multiple continents simultaneously, requires an extraordinary coincidence repeated across multiple populations with no demonstrated contact between them. Common origin requires only one thing: a symbolic tradition old enough and stable enough to have been carried out of Africa before the populations heading toward Europe and the populations heading toward Southeast Asia ever went their separate ways. Given that the European data alone already shows 65% of the system arriving fully formed in the earliest caves, suggesting a pre-European origin, the common origin explanation is not simply plausible. It may be the simpler of the two options available. And that is exactly where this story currently sits, at the edge of what can be proven and what can only be pointed toward. Here is what the evidence has established with real confidence, stated plainly. These marks were not random. They were not idle doodling. They were not meaningless decoration added as an afterthought to more important figurative artwork sitting nearby on the same walls. 32 specific signs, maintained with recognizable consistency across 30,000 years and an entire continent, outnumbering the famous animal paintings 2-1, represents deliberate, sustained, symbolic communication of some kind. The consistency alone proves intent. The geographic spread proves transmission. The timeline proves durability on a scale no other known symbolic system in the entire history of the human species has ever matched. And here is what nobody can currently answer, stated with equal plainness: what any of it actually means. Researchers have proposed interpretations: hunting tallies, recording kills or seasonal game movements, territorial markers identifying which group claimed a particular cave or passage, seasonal calendars tracking solstices or migration cycles, proto-writing systems representing an early formalized attempt to encode spoken language in visual form, ritual or spiritual notation recording ceremonial information meant to be understood only by initiates who already knew the system. None of these interpretations has been confirmed. None has been definitively falsified either. The evidence, as it currently stands, is simply not sufficient to distinguish between them with any real confidence, because the one thing that would make that distinction possible does not exist and almost certainly never will. There is no Rosetta Stone for these signs, no bilingual text sitting somewhere in a cave, translating the geometric marks into a language anyone alive today can read. No living oral tradition connecting any modern human community to the specific meaning these symbols carried for the people who painted them 40,000 years ago. The chain of transmission that kept this system alive and consistent for 30,000 years eventually broke, sometime after the last Ice Age caves were painted roughly 10,000 years ago, and whatever specific meaning those 32 signs carried broke along with it. That is a genuinely difficult truth to sit with. The longest-running communication system in human history, maintained with extraordinary consistency for 300 centuries, and its content may be permanently, irreversibly unrecoverable, even if the system itself is eventually mapped in exhaustive detail across every surviving cave site on every continent where it appears. Think about what that actually represents in human terms before this story closes. Somebody, 40,000 years ago, walked deep into a cave, past the entrance, past the daylight, into passages so dark that a torch or a fat lamp was the only source of light available. They mixed pigment deliberately. They selected a specific spot on a specific wall, and they carefully, intentionally painted a symbol they clearly expected someone else to understand, in a location where no casual visitor would ever stumble across it by accident. They sent a message, and that message was received, understood, and repeated again and again across 300 centuries of continuous human use by people who clearly shared the same symbolic framework the original painter had been working inside of. We know the message was sent, we know it was received, we know it was maintained, faithfully, for longer than any other symbolic system ever documented on this planet. We simply cannot read it. The longest conversation in human history is still playing out on those cave walls, and the only thing missing is anyone left alive who still knows the language. For over a century, the world stared at the horses and the bison and missed what was sitting right next to them. 32 geometric signs, repeated across 368 cave sites, spanning 30,000 years in an entire continent, carried by human hands into the deepest, darkest passages where no casual visitor would ever see them. They outnumber the animal paintings 2-1. They arrived in Europe nearly fully formed, suggesting an origin even older than the caves themselves. And they appear in recognizably similar form on cave walls on the opposite side of the planet, separated by thousands of miles of open ocean and tens of thousands of years of independent human history. Somebody was saying something, deliberately, consistently, for longer than any other symbolic system in the entire history of our species, and nobody alive today has any idea what it was. The message survived. The meaning did not. Subscribe for the next investigation.